My name is Linda, and I'm 26 years old. I've always believed that family is supposed to be your safe haven, the one place where you never have to worry about someone hurting you on purpose. Growing up with my younger sister Janet, we had our typical sibling rivalry, sure, but I thought that was just normal sister stuff. We'd argue over clothes, fight about who got to use the bathroom first. The usual things. But there are some boundaries that should never be crossed, some lines that once you step over them, there's no going back. I learned that lesson the hard way when the person I trusted most in the world decided to turn my daily routine into a nightmare that would leave me scarred in more ways than one. Before I dive into what happened, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button if you've ever felt overlooked in your own family. And don't forget to subscribe, because this story will show you just how far jealousy can push someone you trust. Janet and I grew up in a modest 3-bedroom house in Columbus, Ohio, where the neighbors knew each other's business, and everyone waved from their front porches. Our parents, Martha and Harold, worked hard to provide for us. Dad managed a small auto parts store, and Mom worked part-time at the local library. They weren't wealthy, but we never went without the basics. From as early as I can remember, my parents had this habit of comparing Janet and me in ways that seemed harmless at the time, but created an undercurrent of competition that would eventually turn toxic. I was the studious one, always bringing home A's, winning spelling bees, getting into honor society. Janet was the pretty one, the charmer who could make adults laugh and had natural artistic talent that everyone admired. Mom would say things like, "Linda's got the brains, and Janet's got the beauty," as if we were two halves of one complete person instead of individuals with our own worth. I had just graduated from Ohio State with a marketing degree and landed my first real job at a small advertising agency downtown. The pay wasn't great, but it was a start, and I was proud of my independence. Living at home made financial sense while I built up my savings for my own place. Janet was finishing her senior year at the local community college, studying art with no clear direction about what she wanted to do after graduation. My daily routine was pretty structured. I'd wake up at 6:30, shower with my favorite lavender soap that I'd been using for years, because I had sensitive skin, get dressed, grab coffee, and head to work. Janet usually slept until noon, which meant I rarely saw her in the mornings. That soap was special to me, not just because it was gentle on my skin, but because it had been a gift from my grandmother before she passed away. She'd bought me a whole case of it, saying it was what she'd used her whole life and it would keep my skin soft. The tension in our house had been building gradually over the past few months. As I settled into my career and started talking about moving out eventually, my parents began putting more pressure on Janet to figure out her life. They'd make comments at dinner about how Linda already has her act together while Janet was still trying to find herself. I could see the frustration building in my sister's eyes every time they praised my job or asked when she was going to start contributing financially to the household. Janet started making little cutting remarks about my perfect life and how everything came so easily to me. She'd roll her eyes when I talked about work projects or make sarcastic comments about how I was such a responsible adult. I chalked it up to typical sister dynamics and the stress she was under about her future. I even tried to be supportive, offering to help her with job applications or practice interviews. But there were small things that started bothering me. I'd noticed my personal items moved around in the bathroom we shared. My shampoo bottle would be in a different spot, my toothbrush facing the wrong direction, little things that made me feel like my space was being invaded. When I mentioned it, Janet would act confused and deny touching anything. My parents would tell me I was being too particular about things that didn't matter. The soap situation started so subtly that I almost didn't notice at first. I'd reach for my usual bar, and it would feel slightly different in my hands. Maybe a little rougher, or not quite the same shape. But it looked the same, that familiar cream color with tiny lavender flecks, so I assumed maybe the company had changed their formula slightly, or I was just imagining things. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Tuesday morning in late September. After my usual shower, I noticed my skin felt different, drier than normal, especially around my shoulders and upper arms. I'd been using the same soap for over 2 years without any problems, so I figured maybe it was just the change in weather. Ohio autumns could be unpredictable, and maybe the cooler air was affecting my skin. By Thursday, the dryness had turned into a slight itching sensation that persisted throughout the day at work. I found myself scratching my arms unconsciously during meetings, which was embarrassing. The itching was subtle but constant, like a low-level irritation that I couldn't quite pinpoint. I tried using more moisturizer after my showers, thinking that would solve the problem. Janet seemed unusually interested in my morning routine during this time. She'd linger in the hallway when I was getting ready for work, asking questions like, "How did you sleep?" and "Everything okay with you?" with what seemed like genuine concern. At first, I appreciated what I thought was her caring about my well-being. She'd even comment on how I looked tired or stressed, suggesting maybe I should take better care of myself. The weekend brought no relief. If anything, the itching got worse, and I started noticing small red patches on my skin where I'd been scratching. The areas looked irritated and felt warm to the touch. I decided to switch to a different moisturizer, thinking maybe I'd developed an allergy to my usual brand. On Sunday evening, as I was preparing my work clothes for the week, Janet knocked on my bedroom door. She came in with a concerned expression and sat on my bed. "Linda, I've been worried about you," she said, her voice soft with what sounded like sisterly affection. "You seem really stressed lately, and I notice you've been scratching a lot. Maybe it's anxiety manifesting physically?" Her concern seemed genuine, and I felt bad for sometimes finding her annoying. Here she was, trying to be a caring sister, and I'd been dismissive of her attempts to connect. "I think I might be having some kind of allergic reaction," I told her, showing her the red patches on my arms. "I'm not sure what's causing it." Janet examined my skin with a worried frown. "That looks uncomfortable. Have you changed anything in your routine lately? New detergent, different foods, anything like that?" When I shook my head, she suggested, "Maybe it's just stress from work. You've been putting a lot of pressure on yourself to succeed." My parents echoed Janet's theory when I mentioned my skin issues at dinner that night. Dad nodded knowingly and said, "Job stress can do funny things to your body." I remember when I first started managing the store, I broke out in hives for a month. Mom agreed, adding that I should try to relax more and maybe take some vacation time. Their explanations made sense, and I felt better having a reasonable cause for what was happening. I decided to try some stress reduction techniques and see if that helped. What I didn't notice was the way Janet's eyes lit up slightly when our parents dismissed my concerns as stress-related, or how she quickly changed the subject when I started to describe my symptoms in detail. By the end of that first week, I was applying cortisone cream twice a day and taking antihistamines before bed, but nothing seemed to help. The itching was affecting my sleep, and I was starting to feel run down and irritable. I kept using my regular soap because it never occurred to me that something I'd been using safely for years could suddenly become the problem. Looking back, I should have paid more attention to Janet's questions about my routine and her suggestions about what might be causing my issues. But at the time, I was just grateful to have family members who seemed to care about my well-being, even if they weren't taking my physical symptoms as seriously as I thought they should. The second week brought a dramatic escalation that should have sent me straight to the emergency room, but instead, I found myself caught between denial and a growing sense that something was seriously wrong. The mild irritation had transformed into something that looked like a chemical burn spreading across my upper body. Monday morning, I woke up to find that the red patches had doubled in size overnight and were now raised, angry welts that oozed clear fluid when I accidentally scratched them. The pain was no longer just itching, but a burning sensation that felt like someone was holding a hot iron against my skin. Looking in the bathroom mirror, I gasped at my reflection. My shoulders, upper chest, and arms looked like they'd been attacked by some kind of flesh-eating disease. Getting dressed for work became an ordeal. Any fabric that touched the affected areas felt like sandpaper against raw wounds. I had to dig through my closet to find loose-fitting, long-sleeve shirts that wouldn't cling to the damaged skin. Even then, by the time I got to the office, I could feel the fabric sticking to the weeping areas where my skin was breaking down. My coworkers immediately noticed something was wrong. Sarah from accounting took one look at me and asked if I was feeling all right. I tried to brush off her concern, claiming I was just tired, but when I rolled up my sleeves slightly during a meeting, I saw her eyes widen in shock at the visible damage to my arms. By lunch, 3 different people had suggested I should see a doctor immediately. The burning sensation was constant now, like living with a sunburn that never faded. I found myself taking bathroom breaks every hour just to splash cool water on my arms, which provided temporary relief but also meant removing my shirt and seeing the full extent of what was happening to my body. The skin wasn't just red anymore. It was starting to peel off in strips, leaving raw, pink flesh underneath that was incredibly sensitive to touch. At home that evening, I knew I couldn't hide what was happening anymore. When I showed my parents the extent of the damage, their reaction was not what I expected. Instead of the concern and urgency I was hoping for, they seemed more annoyed than worried. Dad barely looked up from his newspaper when I rolled up my sleeves at the dinner table, Linda, you really need to stop picking at your skin, Mom said with exasperation. You're making it worse by obsessing over it. Maybe if you just left it alone, it would heal naturally. I'm not picking at it, I protested, my voice rising with frustration. Look at this. This isn't normal. Something is seriously wrong. Janet leaned forward to examine my arms with what appeared to be deep concern. Oh my goodness, Linda, that looks awful. You poor thing. She turned to our parents with a worried expression. Maybe she should see a dermatologist. This looks really serious. But instead of supporting Janet's suggestion, Dad waved his hand dismissively. Doctors just want to run expensive tests and prescribe medications you don't need. It's probably just eczema or something. People lived for thousands of years without running to the doctor every time they had a skin problem. The dismissal from my own family was almost more painful than the physical symptoms. Here I was, clearly suffering from something that was getting worse by the day, and they were treating me like a hypochondriac who couldn't handle a minor skin irritation. That night, I lay in bed, unable to sleep, because any position I tried put pressure on the damaged areas. The sheets felt like they were made of steel wool, and every time I moved, I could feel more skin flaking off. I started to wonder if I was dying from some rare disease that my family couldn't recognize because they'd never seen anything like it. The next morning, I made the decision to see a doctor regardless of what my family thought. The burning had intensified overnight, and when I looked in the mirror, I saw that the peeling had spread to areas that hadn't been affected before. Something was very wrong, and I couldn't wait for my family to take me seriously. Dr. Patterson, the dermatologist I managed to get an emergency appointment with, took one look at my skin and immediately started asking detailed questions about chemical exposure. This looks like a contact burn from something caustic, he said, his brow furrowed with concern. Have you been working with any cleaning products, industrial chemicals, or anything like that? I went through my entire daily routine with him, listing every product I used from my toothpaste to my laundry detergent. He was particularly interested in anything new I might have introduced, but I assured him that I had been using the same products for months or even years. My soap, shampoo, moisturizer, everything was familiar and had never caused problems before. Chemical burns like this don't just happen, Dr. Patterson said, prescribing a strong topical steroid and recommending I eliminate products one by one to identify the culprit. Something you're putting on your skin is causing this reaction. We need to figure out what it is before permanent damage occurs. Permanent damage. Those words echoed in my head as I drove home with my prescription, and a growing sense of dread about what was happening to my body. The third week was when my world completely collapsed, though not in the way I expected. What started as a medical mystery was about to become a revelation that would destroy my faith in the people I loved most. By now, the pain was excruciating. The steroid cream Dr. Patterson had prescribed helped with the inflammation, but new areas of my skin continued to break down faster than the medication could heal them. I'd started taking photos to document the progression, partly for medical purposes and partly because I couldn't believe how bad it was getting. My chest, back, shoulders, and arms looked like a war zone. The peeling had created a patchwork of raw, weeping flesh and areas where new skin was trying to form but kept getting damaged again. I had to sleep sitting up in a chair because lying down was impossible. Work became nearly unbearable, not just because of the physical pain, but because I was constantly worried about the smell of the medicated cream and whether people could see the damage through my clothes. But the worst part was the isolation I felt from my own family. Every time I tried to talk about what was happening, they'd find ways to minimize it or change the subject. Mom started making comments about how I was always dramatic about health issues and bringing up times when I was a kid that I'd supposedly exaggerated minor injuries. Dad would just grunt and leave the room whenever I mentioned seeing the doctor again. Janet, on the other hand, seemed increasingly fascinated by my condition. She'd ask to see the progress every day, wincing sympathetically and offering suggestions for home remedies she'd read about online. Maybe you should try oatmeal baths, she'd say. Or, I heard aloe vera can work miracles on skin damage. Her attention felt like the only compassion I was getting in the house. On Thursday evening of that third week, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. The burning had become so intense that I was considering going to the emergency room. As I gathered my things to head to the hospital, I realized I should probably bring all my toiletries to show the doctors exactly what I'd been using. I grabbed my shampoo, conditioner, body wash, and the bar of soap I'd been using for years. As I picked up the soap to put it in my bag, something felt different about it. The texture seemed rougher than usual, and it was lighter than I remembered. On impulse, I held it up to the light and noticed that it seemed almost hollow, like there wasn't as much soap inside as there should be. Curious now, I took the bar to my bedroom and examined it more closely under my desk lamp. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The soap, which should have been solid lavender-colored all the way through, had a distinct white core visible through a crack in the surface. And when I brought it closer to my nose, underneath the familiar lavender scent was something else, something sharp and chemical that made my nose burn. My hands started shaking as the horrible possibility began to dawn on me. This wasn't my soap. Or rather, it was my soap, but someone had tampered with it. Someone had hollowed it out and filled it with something else, then disguised it to look normal from the outside. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed a knife, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Back in my room, I carefully sliced the bar in half, and what I found inside made me physically sick. The entire center of the soap had been carved out and filled with what was unmistakably bleach. The smell hit me like a punch to the face, that familiar sharp chemical odor that meant industrial cleaning products. Someone had been making me bathe in bleach for 3 weeks. Someone had deliberately turned my daily hygiene routine into a form of torture, watching me suffer and pretend concern while knowing exactly what was causing my agony. And there was only one person who had access to my bathroom, who knew my routines, who had been asking so many questions about my symptoms, while seeming so caring and concerned. I stormed to Janet's room with the destroyed soap in my hands, fury and betrayal burning in my chest hotter than any chemical burn on my skin. She was lying on her bed, scrolling through her phone, and when she saw me standing in her doorway holding the evidence, her face went completely white. "What is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking with rage. "What did you do to my soap?" Janet sat up quickly, her eyes darting between my face and the soap in my hands. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice was high and uncertain, the way it used to sound when we were kids, and she'd been caught in a lie. "Don't you dare lie to me," I shouted, probably loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "You hollowed out my soap and filled it with bleach. You've been poisoning me for weeks. Look at what you did to me." I pulled up my sleeves and showed her the full extent of the damage to my arms. For a moment, Janet just stared at the evidence of what her actions had caused. I saw something flicker across her face, maybe remorse or shock at seeing the results of her plan laid out so clearly. But then her expression hardened into something I'd never seen before, a coldness that made her look like a stranger. "You can't prove anything," she said finally. "Maybe someone else did it. Maybe you did it to yourself for attention." That accusation hit me like a physical blow. The idea that anyone could think I would intentionally cause myself this kind of pain and suffering was so outrageous that for a moment I couldn't even respond. But then the rage came back even stronger. "I'm calling the police," I told her, pulling out my phone. "This is assault. You poisoned me with bleach for 3 weeks and watched me suffer." That's when Janet finally broke down. "Wait, no, please don't call the police," she said, tears starting to flow down her cheeks. "It wasn't supposed to be this bad. I just wanted you to have some problems for once. I wanted Mom and Dad to see that you're not perfect." "You wanted me to have problems?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You chemical burned half my body because you wanted me to have problems?" "Everyone always talks about how great you are," Janet sobbed. "Linda's so smart. Linda's so responsible. Linda has her life together. What about me? What about what I'm going through? Nobody ever cares about me unless you're not around to steal all the attention." I stared at my sister, this person I'd grown up with, shared a house with, trusted completely, and realized I didn't know her at all. The jealousy and resentment had turned her into someone capable of methodically torturing her own family member while pretending to care about her welfare. "You could have killed me," I whispered. "Bleach on skin for weeks, Janet. Do you understand that you could have caused permanent damage? That I might have scars for the rest of my life?" But Janet was too caught up in her own victimhood to really hear what I was saying. "It's not fair," she kept repeating. "Nothing is ever fair for me." I left her crying in her room and went straight to find our parents. They were watching television in the living room, and when I burst in, holding the evidence and demanding to know if they were going to do something about what Janet had done to me, their reaction was the final betrayal that would change everything forever. Dad looked at the soap, looked at my burns, looked at me, standing there shaking with pain and anger, and started laughing. Actually laughing. "Girls will be girls," he said with a chuckle, like Janet had put salt in my sugar instead of poison in my soap. "It's just a prank that went a little too far." Mom nodded in agreement. "Janet didn't mean any real harm. You're making too big a deal out of this, Linda," Family members played jokes on each other. I stood there in complete shock, holding evidence that my sister had been systematically poisoning me, showing them chemical burns that covered half my torso, and they were calling it a prank. They were taking Janet's side, minimizing what she'd done, and making me feel like I was the unreasonable one for being upset about being tortured in my own home. That was the moment I realized that my family was never going to protect me. They were never going to hold Janet accountable. They were never going to put my safety and well-being ahead of their desire to keep the peace and avoid dealing with the ugly reality of what my sister was capable of. But I was going to protect myself, even if it meant standing alone against all of them. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. The pain was still excruciating, my skin was still damaged and weeping, but my mind was crystal clear about what I needed to do. My family had made it obvious that they weren't going to support me or hold Janet accountable, so I was going to have to be my own advocate and protector. First, I called in sick to work and made an emergency appointment with Dr. Patterson. This time, I brought the tampered soap with me and told him exactly what had happened. His reaction was everything my family should have been. He was horrified, angry on my behalf, and immediately started talking about documenting everything for legal purposes. "This is criminal assault," Dr. Patterson said as he examined my burns with new understanding of their cause. "Deliberate chemical exposure like this could have caused permanent disfigurement or even death if you'd had an allergic reaction. You need to report this to the police immediately." He took detailed photographs of all my injuries, wrote a comprehensive report describing the extent of the damage and the likely cause, and gave me copies of everything. He also referred me to a plastic surgeon, just in case there were going to be permanent scars that needed treatment. My next stop was the police station. I'll never forget the look on Officer Martinez's face when I explained what had happened and showed him the evidence. He listened to my story with growing disbelief and anger, shaking his head as I described my family's reaction to finding out what Janet had done. "So let me get this straight," he said, taking notes. "Your sister intentionally put bleach in your soap, causing severe chemical burns over a significant portion of your body, and when you confronted her and your parents about it, they called it a prank?" Hearing it summarized like that made it sound even more insane than it had felt living through it. Officer Martinez took my statement, photographed the soap and my injuries, and explained that Janet would be charged with assault and battery. Because the injuries were severe and the act was premeditated, it would likely be filed as a felony. But before any of that could happen, I needed to get out of that house. I couldn't spend another night under the same roof as someone who had poisoned me and parents who thought that was acceptable behavior. I called my friend Beverly from college, explained the situation, and asked if I could stay with her temporarily. Beverly's reaction was the opposite of my family's. She was outraged, immediately offered me her spare room, and insisted on driving over to help me pack and confront my family herself. "Are you kidding me right now?" she said when I told her about my parents' response. "Linda, this is insane. You could have died." When Beverly and I arrived at the house to get my things, my parents and Janet were sitting in the living room like they were staging an intervention. Dad stood up as soon as we walked in and started talking about how I was overreacting and tearing the family apart over nothing. "Nothing?" Beverly interrupted before I could say anything. "You call chemical burns that required medical treatment nothing? What is wrong with you people?" Mom tried to play peacemaker, suggesting that we all sit down and work this out as a family without involving outsiders like police and lawyers. Janet sat there crying dramatically, talking about how she never meant for things to go so far, and how sorry she was that I was hurt. But I was done listening to their justifications and excuses. "I'm moving out today," I announced, "and Janet is going to be arrested for assault. If any of you try to contact me or convince me to drop the charges, I'll get a restraining order." The shock on their faces was almost comical. They clearly expected me to eventually calm down and let them sweep this under the rug like they had with every other conflict in our family. The idea that there might be real consequences for Janet's actions, that I might actually follow through on involving law enforcement, had never seriously occurred to them. Dad started getting angry then, talking about how I was destroying the family and being vindictive toward my sister. "Janet made a mistake," he said. "She's your sister. You don't send family to jail over a mistake." "A mistake is adding salt instead of sugar to coffee," I replied, my voice steady despite the fury I felt inside. "Poisoning someone with bleach for 3 weeks isn't a mistake. It's attempted murder." Janet started sobbing harder at that, claiming I was being dramatic and that she never wanted to seriously hurt me. But I noticed she never actually apologized or took full responsibility for what she'd done. It was all about how sorry she was that things had gone wrong, not about the deliberate choice she'd made to hurt me. Beverly helped me pack my essential belongings, while my family continued their attempts to guilt me into staying and dropping the charges. They tried everything from appeals to family loyalty to threats about how this would affect Janet's future. None of it worked. I was done being the reasonable one, the one who kept the peace, the one who put family harmony ahead of my own well-being. As we loaded my car, neighbors started coming out to see what was happening. The police had apparently already been by to speak with Janet, and word was getting around the neighborhood that something serious had occurred. I saw Mrs. Henderson from next door staring at the police car in our driveway with obvious curiosity. That evening, safe in Beverly's spare room, I made a list of everything I needed to do. File a formal complaint with the police, follow up with the district attorney's office, find a lawyer to explore civil damages, change my address with my employer and bank, and start looking for my own apartment. It was overwhelming, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was taking control of my situation instead of just enduring it. The hardest part was accepting that my relationship with my family was probably over. Not just with Janet, who had proven she was capable of serious harm, but with my parents, who had shown they would never put my safety ahead of their desire to avoid conflict. The people who were supposed to protect me had failed completely, and I was going to have to build a new life without them. But as I lay in Beverly's comfortable guest bed, finally able to sleep lying down because I felt safe for the first time in weeks, I realized that I was stronger than I'd ever known. I had stood up for myself when no one else would. I had refused to accept being treated as less important than family peace. I had chosen my own well-being over other people's comfort. It was terrifying and liberating at the same time. The legal process moved faster than I expected. Within a week, Janet was formally charged with assault and battery with a dangerous weapon. The dangerous weapon classification came from the fact that she had used bleach, which is legally considered a caustic substance capable of causing severe bodily harm. The prosecutor, a woman named Lisa Chen, was particularly aggressive in pursuing the case because of the premeditated nature of the crime and the severity of my injuries. Janet's first reaction was to hire a lawyer who immediately started trying to negotiate a plea deal. They wanted to plead it down to a misdemeanor with probation and community service. But Lisa Chen wasn't interested in letting someone who had systematically poisoned a family member for weeks get off with a slap on the wrist. "This isn't a case of sibling rivalry gone wrong," she explained to me during one of our meetings. "This is a case of deliberate, sustained assault that could have resulted in permanent disfigurement or death. The fact that the victim was her sister actually makes it worse, not better, because it shows a complete lack of empathy and an abuse of trust." The story hit the local news when Janet's arrest became public record. "Local woman charged with poisoning sister's soap with bleach" was the headline in the Columbus Dispatch, and it quickly spread to social media and regional news outlets. Suddenly, everyone in our community knew what had happened, and the reactions were sharply divided. Some people were horrified and supportive, reaching out to offer help or just to express their shock that something like this could happen. Others seemed to think I was overreacting, that family disputes should be handled privately, or that sending my own sister to jail was somehow worse than what she had done to me. My parents fell firmly into the second category. They started a campaign to pressure me into dropping the charges, enlisting extended family members, family friends, and even our old pastor to call and explain how I was tearing the family apart. The message was always the same. Janet was sorry, she'd learned her lesson, and putting her in jail wouldn't undo what had happened to me. What they didn't understand was that this was never about revenge. It was about consequences and protection. Janet had shown that she was capable of seriously harming me while pretending to care about my welfare. She had proven that her jealousy and resentment could drive her to actions that put my life at risk. And my parents had shown that they would enable and excuse that behavior rather than hold her accountable. I needed legal protection from all of them. The civil lawsuit was almost easier than the criminal case. My lawyer, David Richardson, explained that we had an incredibly strong case for damages covering my medical expenses, lost wages, pain and suffering, and ongoing therapy costs. The evidence was undeniable, the injuries were well documented, and the deliberate nature of Janet's actions made punitive damages almost certain. Most personal injury cases involve accidents or negligence, David explained. Cases where someone deliberately causes harm are much rarer and typically result in significant awards. Your sister's actions were so far beyond acceptable behavior that a jury is going to want to send a message. The hardest part was dealing with the ongoing health consequences. Even with proper medical treatment, my skin was healing slowly and unevenly. Dr. Patterson warned me that some areas might have permanent sensitivity or discoloration. I had to use special moisturizers, avoid certain fabrics, and stay out of direct sunlight for months while my skin recovered. But the psychological damage was in some ways worse than the physical injuries. I found myself checking and double-checking every product I used, unable to trust that anyone hadn't tampered with my belongings. I had nightmares about discovering that other things in my life had been sabotaged. I felt paranoid and hypervigilant in ways that exhausted me. Beverly suggested I start seeing a therapist, and Dr. Sarah Kim helped me understand that what I was experiencing was a form of post-traumatic stress. When someone close to you betrays your trust in such a fundamental way, she explained, it can shake your ability to feel safe in the world. Your hypervigilance is a normal response to an abnormal situation. Therapy helped, but it also opened my eyes to patterns in my family that I'd never recognized before. The way my parents had always dismissed my concerns, the way they'd enabled Janet's jealousy and competition, the way they'd trained me to prioritize family peace over my own needs. What Janet had done was an extreme escalation, but it grew out of a family dynamic that had been unhealthy for years. 3 months after Janet's arrest, she finally accepted a plea deal. She pled guilty to assault and battery with a dangerous weapon and was sentenced to 6 months in jail, followed by 2 years of probation, 200 hours of community service, and mandatory psychological counseling. She also had to pay restitution for all my medical expenses and legal fees. The day of her sentencing, my parents sat in the courtroom, glaring at me like I was the criminal. Janet read a prepared statement about how sorry she was, and how she hoped someday I could forgive her. But when the judge asked if she wanted to make any additional comments, she looked directly at me and said, "I never meant for it to go this far." Even then, even in court, even after pleading guilty, she couldn't take full responsibility for what she'd done. It was still about her intentions rather than her actions. Still about minimizing the harm she'd caused, rather than acknowledging the full extent of what she'd put me through. But I didn't need her acknowledgement anymore. I had the acknowledgement of the legal system, the medical community, and everyone else who mattered. I had protected myself when no one else would, and I had ensured that there were consequences for what had been done to me. For the first time in months, I felt like I could start moving forward instead of just surviving. 1 year later, I can honestly say that cutting ties with my family was the best decision I ever made for my mental health and safety. It wasn't easy, and there were times when the loneliness felt overwhelming, but the peace I found was worth every difficult moment. My skin healed better than Dr. Patterson initially expected, though I still have some areas of permanent sensitivity and slight discoloration on my shoulders. They're not noticeable to most people, but they serve as a daily reminder of what I survived and how strong I had to become to protect myself. I've learned to see them not as disfigurement, but as proof of my resilience. The therapy with Dr. Kim continued for almost a year and helped me understand not just how to heal from what Janet did, but how to recognize and avoid toxic relationship patterns in the future. I learned about setting boundaries, trusting my instincts, and prioritizing my own well-being without guilt. These weren't skills I'd learned growing up in my family, where keeping the peace was always more important than individual safety or happiness. Beverly became more than just a friend who helped me in a crisis. She became the sister I'd always wished I had, someone who celebrated my successes without resentment, and supported me through difficulties without judgment. Her family welcomed me into their holiday celebrations and family gatherings, showing me what healthy family dynamics actually looked like. I found my own apartment 6 months after leaving my parents' house. A bright one-bedroom place with huge windows and a bathroom that was entirely my own. The first time I used my own soap and my own shower without fear was an emotional moment I'll never forget. Such a simple thing, but it represented complete control over my own safety and environment. Work became a refuge and a source of pride. My colleagues had been incredibly supportive throughout the legal proceedings, and my boss actually gave me a promotion during my recovery period, saying my grace under pressure had impressed everyone in the office. Having professional success that was entirely my own, without family commentary or comparison, helped rebuild my confidence in ways I hadn't expected. The civil lawsuit settled out of court for an amount that covered all my expenses and provided some compensation for pain and suffering. Janet's insurance company decided it was cheaper to settle than to risk a jury trial, especially given the publicity the case had received. The money helped me get established in my new life, but more importantly, it represented official acknowledgement that what had been done to me was wrong and costly. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Janet completed her jail sentence in community service, though I have no direct contact with her or my parents. Apparently, she moved to another state after finishing her probation, and my parents tell people that we had a falling out without mentioning the criminal charges or the reason behind our estrangement. Sometimes people who don't know the full story ask if I miss my family, or if I regret letting things go so far. But I've learned that people who ask those questions fundamentally don't understand what it's like to have your safety threatened by the people who are supposed to protect you. They can't imagine making the choice between family relationships and personal well-being because they've never had to. I don't miss the anxiety of never knowing when Janet's jealousy might lead to another prank. I don't miss my parents' dismissal of my concerns or their tendency to prioritize conflict avoidance over justice. I don't miss walking on eggshells to keep everyone else comfortable while my own needs went unmet. What I've gained is so much more valuable than what I lost. I've gained self-respect, the ability to trust my own instincts, and the knowledge that I'm strong enough to protect myself even when it means standing alone. I've gained friendships based on mutual respect rather than family obligation. I've gained the peace that comes from living authentically instead of constantly managing other people's emotions. I started dating someone last month, a kind man named Tom, who works in software development. When I told him about my family situation, his reaction was immediate support and admiration for my strength in handling it. That must have been incredibly difficult, he said, but I'm glad you protected yourself. You deserve people in your life who would never hurt you like that. It was such a simple response, but it highlighted how different my life is now from what it used to be. I'm surrounded by people who think my safety and happiness matter, who wouldn't dream of asking me to sacrifice my well-being for someone else's convenience. The nightmares have mostly stopped, though I still have moments of hypervigilance about my personal belongings. Dr. Kim says that's normal and may never completely go away, but it's manageable and doesn't interfere with my daily life anymore. I've learned to see it as a reasonable precaution rather than paranoia. I think about Janet sometimes, wondering if she ever truly understood the magnitude of what she did, or if she still sees herself as the victim in our story. I hope she got help and learned to deal with her jealousy and resentment in healthier ways. But I don't need to know for certain, because her growth, or lack thereof, is no longer my responsibility. The most important thing I've learned is that family is supposed to be a source of love and support, not a burden you have to carry regardless of how they treat you. When family members harm you, you have every right to protect yourself, even if that means cutting ties completely. You don't owe anyone access to your life if they use that access to hurt you. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones who hurt you the deepest. But you always have the choice to walk away and choose yourself. And that choice, no matter how painful, can set you free in ways you never imagined. If you've made it this far in my story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and your own safety? Have you ever felt like you were being dramatic for setting boundaries with people who hurt you? Let me know in the comments below because your experiences matter, and you're not alone in whatever you've been through. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who might need to hear that it's okay to protect yourself, even from family. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about overcoming toxic relationships and building a life on your own terms. Thank you for listening to my story and for supporting survivors who have had to make difficult choices to protect themselves. Remember that you deserve people in your life who celebrate your success rather than sabotage it, and you never have to apologize for choosing your own safety and happiness. Stay strong, trust your instincts, and never let anyone convince you that love requires you to accept being harmed.